Buried beneath cold earth, in a quiet graveyard of 1884, a faint cry broke the night. Gravediggers froze in terror because the sound came from inside a freshly sealed coffin. What they uncovered would shock an entire town and make history remember the baby who refused to die. It was the winter of 1884, in a small rural town on the outskirts of London. The night was cold, the ground hard with frost, and the only sound that filled the graveyard was the slow creak of wooden carts and the muffled thud of shovels striking frozen soil. Two gravediggers, Thomas Hawley and Edward Morris, worked silently under the dim glow of their lanterns, finishing the last burial of the evening. The funeral earlier that day had been quiet. A poor family had buried their infant daughter, a tragedy far too common in those years. The priest had spoken a few words about innocence and mercy, and the small coffin had been lowered into the ground as the mother wept into her shawl. No one could have imagined that night would not end there. As the men finished covering the grave, Thomas paused. A strange feeling crept up his spine, like the earth itself was breathing. He brushed it off as exhaustion, but then it came again, a sound faint but unmistakable. A cry. Edward looked up sharply. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Thomas held his breath. The cry came again, soft, fragile, and rising from beneath their feet. Both men froze. Their lanterns trembled in their hands. "Impossible," Edward muttered. "It's the wind. It must be the wind." But it wasn't. The sound was clearer now, the cry of a living baby, muffled by wood and earth. Thomas dropped his shovel and began digging with his bare hands, his heart pounding against his ribs. Edward hesitated, fear and disbelief written across his face, but joined in moments later. Dirt flew as their hands tore through the soil. When they reached the coffin, they could hear it plainly, a cry, desperate and real. Thomas pried open the wooden lid with his spade. The hinges creaked. Inside, wrapped in burial linen, was the baby, alive. Both men staggered back in shock. The infant's chest rose and fell weakly, her lips trembling as she gasped for air. The candlelight flickered over her tiny face, pale but unmistakably alive. In the frozen graveyard of 1884, under the gaze of the dead, life had defied death itself. Thomas Hawley stood trembling beside the open grave, the newborn crying softly in his arms. His fingers were numb from the cold, but his heart raced with warmth and disbelief. Edward, still pale as chalk, stared into the coffin as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. This child was buried this morning," Edward whispered. "I saw it myself." Thomas didn't reply. He wrapped his coat around the infant and began walking toward the caretaker's cottage at the edge of the cemetery. The wind howled through the leafless trees as if carrying whispers from the graves. The world, silent moments ago, now seemed to pulse with impossible life. When they reached the cottage, the caretaker's wife, Mrs. Abbott, gasped and nearly dropped her lantern. The baby's face was pale blue, her breathing shallow but steady. They placed her near the fire, feeding her warm milk drop by drop. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks. By morning, word had spread. Villagers gathered outside the cemetery gates, murmuring prayers and crossing themselves. Some called it a miracle. Others whispered that it was witchcraft. The priest, Father McGill, arrived soon after. His expression was grave as he examined the child. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," he murmured, "but I have never seen him return what was taken." When he turned to Thomas and Edward, both men looked exhausted, their faces smeared with dirt. "You say you heard her cry?" the priest asked. Thomas nodded. "Twice, clear as you and I are speaking." Father McGill studied the coffin. No air holes, no damage, no sign of tampering. The burial records were checked, and indeed, the baby had been declared dead by the local doctor. Her name was Clara Bellamy, the daughter of a poor shoemaker. The doctor was summoned in disbelief. "It can't be," he insisted. "I examined her myself. There was no pulse, no breath, but when he saw the child alive in Mrs. Abbott's arms, his hands began to shake." The town of Cranleigh soon became the center of attention. Reporters from London arrived, filling the inn and sketching pictures of the miracle child. The local paper called her the baby who defied death, but behind the wonder, a dark question lingered. Had Clara truly risen from death, or had she been buried alive? The town of Cranleigh buzzed with whispers that refused to die down. What began as a miracle had turned into a mystery, one that no one could explain. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the same physician who had declared little Clara Bellamy dead, sat in the mayor's office, his hands trembling. "I examined the child thoroughly," he insisted. "No heartbeat, no breath, no sign of life. I would have sworn it before the Queen herself." Mayor Henderson paced the wooden floor. "Then how do you explain this, doctor? A child alive after being buried for nearly 12 hours? The doctor's eyes flickered toward the window, where townsfolk crowded outside, waiting for answers. "Perhaps." He hesitated. "Perhaps she was in a state of suspended animation. It's rare, but not impossible. The body slows so much, even a trained physician can be fooled." Outside, Thomas Hawley and Edward watched as two constables sealed the gravesite. They lifted the tiny coffin from the earth and placed it in a wagon. Its wood was damp from the night's mist, but unbroken, a haunting reminder of what nearly happened. As the investigation deepened, the Bellamy family, poor and heartbroken, was summoned. Clara's mother fainted when she saw her child alive. "I prayed for a miracle," she wept, "but I never dreamed God would answer this way." Yet behind every tear of joy lurked suspicion. Some villagers claimed the gravediggers had staged the scene for money. Others whispered that the baby's cry was the voice of the dead, a sign of unfinished souls. Father McGill tried to calm them. "Fear not the unknown," he told the gathering at Sunday Mass, "for even in death, God's hand may still work miracles." But doubt had already taken root. Within days, London newspapers published the headline, "Child Buried Alive, Miracle or Medical Blunder." The coroner arrived from the city to re-examine the case. He studied the coffin, the soil, the burial records. Every detail was precise. There was no foul play, no trick. And yet, the impossible had happened. Late that evening, Dr. Whitmore sat by the fire in his home, staring into the flames. "How many have we buried," he whispered, "that were never truly gone?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke curling above the hearth. The following morning, the usually quiet town of Cranleigh woke to the sound of horse carriages. The London coroner, Sir Henry Blackwell, had arrived. His reputation was formidable, a man known to uncover the truth, even from the dead. The small parlor of the Bellamy home became his temporary office. He placed his leather bag on the table, opened his spectacles, and said in a low voice, "Let us begin." The room was heavy with silence. The baby, little Clara Bellamy, now slept peacefully in a crib near the window, as if unaware that her life had become a national headline. Sir Henry examined the coffin first. Its wood bore no signs of forced entry. The nails were still intact, the interior lined with pale silk, only damp from the night's soil. He turned to Dr. Whitmore. "You say she showed no signs of life?" "None, sir," the doctor replied, his voice weary. "No pulse, no movement. Her skin had turned pale and cold. It was death itself." Sir Henry's sharp eyes glinted. "And yet she breathes." He then opened his notebook, scribbling in neat handwriting. "Case may involve premature burial, apparent death due to suspended animation." He explained, in careful words that the family barely understood, that sometimes the human body can enter a trance-like coma, heartbeat nearly undetectable, breath so shallow it mimics death. In the 1800s, without advanced instruments, doctors could easily be deceived. Meanwhile, outside the cottage, a crowd gathered. Reporters from the Times and Daily Telegraph had arrived, sketching the scene, interviewing villagers. "A baby wakes from the grave," one shouted, "proof of life beyond death." But Sir Henry wasn't convinced by miracles. He needed evidence. He visited the grave again, knelt beside the empty pit, and touched the soil. "Still soft," he murmured. She was buried just hours before she awoke. Any longer, and she would not have survived. As dusk fell, he returned to the Bellamy house. Clara's mother was humming softly, rocking the baby in her arms. Her eyes shone with tears, yet her face bore a quiet strength. Sir Henry removed his hat. "Madam," he said gently, "your daughter was never truly dead. She was asleep, deeper than any sleep a man can understand. She awoke not by miracle, but by mercy." The mother smiled faintly. "Mercy or miracle, sir?" "I'll take it all the same." Sir Henry nodded, his gaze distant. "Let this serve as warning to every physician in England. Death may not always be what it seems." Outside, church bells rang softly through the fog. The story would travel far beyond Cranleigh, a reminder to the world that even in the stillness of death, life can whisper back. News of the baby who awoke in the coffin spread faster than wildfire across Victorian England. Within days, newspapers from London to Edinburgh carried the astonishing headline, "Infant returns from the grave, miracle in Cranleigh." At first, people thought it was a hoax, a desperate attempt by a grieving family to gain attention. But when the coroner's report confirmed that little Clara Bellamy had indeed been declared dead and buried, disbelief turned into national obsession. In drawing rooms and pubs alike, people whispered theories. Perhaps she was touched by divine grace. No, it was witchcraft. Or maybe the doctors were blind fools. Meanwhile, the Bellamy family cottage became a pilgrimage site. Women arrived with flowers, priests came to bless the child, and journalists begged for an interview. Mrs. Bellamy refused them all, clutching Clara protectively. In London, the Royal Medical Society held an emergency session. Scholars debated the mystery late into the night, surrounded by the flickering gas lamps of the chamber. Dr. Wilfred Mason, a respected physician, declared, "The child was never dead. It is a case of suspended animation, the heartbeat so faint that even trained men can mistake it for death." But others disagreed. "Greater than. You cannot bring life where there is none," one surgeon protested. This was no accident. It was divine. The argument made headlines for weeks. Religious leaders claimed it as proof of resurrection. Scientists saw it as a failure of medicine. Back in Cranleigh, the Bellamys longed for peace. Yet each day, new visitors arrived. Some knelt outside their garden gate, weeping. Others tried to dig soil from the grave, calling it holy ground. Sir Henry Blackwell, the coroner, grew increasingly uneasy. In his private notes, he wrote, "The public craves miracles, not truth. But truth must endure." Finally, after weeks of chaos, the Bellamys decided to leave. Late one misty evening, they packed their few belongings and boarded a small carriage bound for Bath, hoping to raise Clara in anonymity. As they departed, the townsfolk gathered silently along the dirt road. Some crossed themselves. Some simply watched, unsure whether they had witnessed a mistake of men or a message from God. The baby slept quietly in her mother's arms. The faint rhythm of her breathing, once mistaken for death, was now the most beautiful sound in the world. Far behind them, the empty grave of Cranleigh stood under the moonlight, a reminder that even in the coldest silence of death, life sometimes whispers back. Years passed after that haunting night in Cranleigh, but the legend of the baby who came back from the dead refused to die. Newspapers had moved on, the world had changed, yet whispers about Clara Bellamy still echoed through England's old towns and countryside inns. In 1899, 15 years later, A retired postmaster named Arthur Kent claimed to have seen her, a young woman working as a nurse in Bath General Hospital. He said she had the kindest eyes he had ever seen. But there was something distant, almost otherworldly, in her gaze, as if part of her still lingered in the grave she escaped. Records from the hospital show that a nurse named Clara B. worked there briefly, before disappearing without a trace in 1901. No death certificate, no marriage record, nothing. Some said she left England for Canada, seeking a quiet life. Others believed her frail heart, weakened from birth, finally gave in. But among locals of Bath, a stranger story grew. They swore that on certain cold nights, a woman in white could be seen walking near the churchyard, carrying a single rose and humming a lullaby. The same lullaby Mrs. Bellamy used to sing to her daughter. Years later, in 1912, when the Bellamy home was being renovated, a carpenter discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside was a lock of golden hair tied with a ribbon, and a folded note, faded and yellow with age. It reads simply, "I was not meant to return, but I was given a second breath to remind others that death is not always the end." The handwriting matched that of Elizabeth Bellamy, Clara's mother. What truly happened to the baby found alive in a coffin remains one of the quietest unsolved mysteries of the Victorian era. Historians called it a case of mistaken death, but the villagers of Cranleigh still tell their children, if you hear a soft lullaby near the graveyard at night, it's just Clara reminding us that miracles do happen. And so, beneath the mist of time, her story lingers, half myth, half miracle, but always a whisper of hope against the silence of death.
Thanks you for watch. Every old story holds a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for watch and listen more old times, real stories, and don't forget,